10 years ago, a girl with nothing was pulled from a burning building by a boy who would one day rule half a county. He was 17, she was 10. He did not know her name. She did not know his title. All she knew, as smoke filled her lungs and his arms closed around her, was that a stranger had chosen to save a person nobody else in that village thought was worth saving. He set her down outside the flames, checked that she could stand, and before anyone could pull him back to his waiting carriage, he crouched to her height and made her a promise. He said that if she ever needed someone again, she should find him. He said it the way boys say big things they do not expect to be held to. Then he was gone, swallowed by the dark and the sound of hooves, and Wren Ashdown was left standing in the ash of everything she had ever owned, holding a small silver ring that had slipped from his glove during the rescue. She kept that ring for 10 years. She kept it through the workhouse that took her in and worked her past exhaustion. She kept it through the years she spent scrubbing floors by day and teaching herself letters by candlelight at night, because a woman named Mrs. Pell, who ran the sewing house, believed a clever girl deserved better than a life of scrubbing. She kept it through the seamstress apprenticeship that turned into a talent for fine embroidery, the kind wealthy households paid well for. She kept it through every night she wondered if the boy from the fire even remembered her face. Now she is 20, and she is standing outside the iron gates of Thornbridge Manor, in a blue gown she sewed with her own hands, holding that same ring, asking to see a duke who has not thought of her in years. This is the story of a promise nobody expected to survive 10 winters, a house full of people determined to erase her before she can speak, and a woman who has decided that for once in her life, she will not be the one who disappears quietly. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going together. The gates of Thornbridge Manor were taller than any building Wren had stood beside in her entire life. Black iron curled into the shape of vines and thorns, and beyond them, the manor itself rose out of a green lawn, like something built by people who had never once gone hungry. Wren had walked 3 days to reach this place. Her boots were worn thin at the heel, and the hem of her gown carried the dust of every road between the coastal sewing house where she had spent the last 4 years, and this county she had not seen since she was 10 years old. She had rehearsed what she would say so many times that the words had stopped sounding like her own. A guard at the gate looked her over the way a man looks over something he has already decided is worthless. "Servants' entrance is around the back," he said, "and even that isn't hiring this week." "I'm not here for work," Wren said. "I need to speak with the Duke." The guard laughed, a short bark of a sound. "Of course you do. Half the county needs to speak with the Duke. Get in line, love." Wren held her ground. She had learned, over 10 years of doors closing in her face, that the moment you stepped back was the moment people decided you had no right to be there at all. "Tell him a girl from Millbrook is asking after him," she said. "Tell him it's about a fire." Something in her voice must have carried further than she meant it to, because a second man, older, with a scar along his jaw, stepped out from the gatehouse to look at her properly. His eyes moved from her face to the small pendant resting at her collar, and for a moment his expression flickered with something like recognition, though he said nothing. "Wait here," he said finally, and disappeared through the gates. Wren stood in the cold for what felt like an hour, though it was likely only minutes. Carriages passed on the road behind her, their occupants glancing at her with the same dismissal the first guard had shown. A woman alone at a nobleman's gate, dressed neither poor enough to pity nor fine enough to respect. She kept her hands folded in front of her, the ring pressed into her palm through the fabric of her glove, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had built her entire adult life around a promise made by a boy who might not even remember making it. When the gates finally opened, it was not the Duke who came through them. It was a woman in emerald silk, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once been told to wait for anything. Lady Cordelia Vane, looked Wren over from the toes of her worn boots to the crown of her plain, unpinned hair, and her mouth curved into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You must be the girl causing a commotion at my future husband's gate," Cordelia said. "I don't believe we've met," Wren said carefully. "We haven't, and we won't need to, once you've gone." Cordelia's gaze dropped to the pendant at Wren's throat, and for a moment, something sharp crossed her face before she smoothed it away. "Whatever story you've come here to sell, save your breath. The Duke doesn't see beggars. He has a household to run and a wedding to plan. Mine." Wren felt the words land somewhere just beneath her ribs, but she did not let her face show it. She had faced worse than a well-dressed woman's cruelty. She had faced fire. "I'm not here to beg," Wren said. "I'm here because 10 years ago, a boy from this house pulled me out of a burning building and told me to find him if I ever needed help again. I've come to collect on that." Cordelia's laugh was bright and cold. How touching. A fairy story from a girl in a homemade dress. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only Wren could hear it. "Listen carefully, because I will only say this once. Julian is going to marry me in the spring. Our families have arranged it for years, and nothing you say at this gate is going to change that. Go back to whatever village spat you out, before I have the guards escort you there themselves." She turned and swept back through the gates without waiting for a reply, and the guard with the scarred jaw gave Wren an apologetic look before following her inside. Wren stood alone on the road as the gates closed with a heavy, final sound. She thought about turning back. She thought about the 3 days of walking, the coins she had spent on this journey that she did not have to spare, the years she had spent believing that a promise made in the middle of a burning night meant something. It would have been easier to leave. Nobody would have blamed her. She walked a little way down the road, past a stand of old oaks, and sat on a low stone wall to gather herself. Her feet ached inside boots that had carried her further than they were made for. She unwrapped the small handkerchief she kept in her bag, the one holding the last of her bread, and ate slowly, watching the manor's rooftops through the trees, its many chimneys sending thin ribbons of smoke into the evening sky. She thought of Mrs. Pell, the woman who had taken her in from the workhouse all those years ago, a stern but fair mistress who had once told her, while teaching her to thread a needle steady, even when her hands shook from exhaustion, that the world rewarded people who refused to be moved by cruelty, aimed only at making them small. Wren had held on to that lesson through years of long nights and aching fingers, through the slow, patient climb from workhouse child to skilled seamstress whose embroidery merchants in 3 counties had come to recognize by its careful, even stitches. She thought too of Silas Grieve, the man who owned the sewing house now that Mrs. Pell had passed, a man who smiled at customers and turned cold the moment the shop door closed, who had decided, once he inherited the business, that a debt Mrs. Pell had never actually owed him could be transferred onto Wren instead, along with an offer of marriage to his son that had made her skin crawl the moment he suggested it. She had 3 days head start on him now, if he had even noticed her missing yet, and she did not intend to waste it feeling sorry for herself on a roadside. A cart rumbled past, driven by an older woman hauling milk cans toward the village market. She slowed when she saw Wren sitting on the wall. "You look like you've walked further than your feet can forgive you for, dear," the woman said. "I have," Wren admitted. "Heading toward the manor, were you? I saw you at the gate earlier." The woman's eyes were kind, curious without being unkind about it. They don't let strangers through those gates easily. "Never have." "I noticed," Wren said, managing a small, tired smile. "Climb up, then. I'm headed toward the village myself, and there's a room above the tavern that lets beds by the night for those who need one. You look like you could use a proper night's sleep before you decide what comes next." Wren accepted, grateful in a way she did not fully have words for, and the ride into the village passed in comfortable quiet. She spent that night in a small room above the tavern, listening to the murmur of voices below, and told herself that whatever happened tomorrow, she had already survived worse than a closed gate. She had survived a burning building. She had survived 4 years in a workhouse that fed children just enough to keep them working, and no more. She had survived Silas Greaves' cold smile and his son's wandering eyes. A gate, however tall, however guarded, was not going to be the thing that finally broke her. She would find another way in. Inside the manor, Julian Ashford stood at the window of his study, watching the small figure in blue retreat down the long gravel drive, though he did not yet know her name. He had not seen the exchange at the gate. He had only caught the last of it, a woman walking away with her back straight and her steps unhurried, refusing to run, even though she had clearly just been sent off with nothing. There was something about the way she moved that snagged at a memory he could not place, like a word sitting just behind his tongue. A knock came at his door, and Cordelia entered without waiting to be invited, as she always did. "You'll never guess who came knocking," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Some girl claiming you saved her from a fire a decade ago, rescued her yourself, apparently, and made her some grand promise." She waved a gloved hand, as though brushing away a fly. "I sent her off. These people hear stories about the young Duke's chivalrous history and think they can talk their way into a fortune." Julian's hand, which had been resting on a stack of estate ledgers, went still. "A fire," he repeated. 10 years ago. Does it matter? I handled it. What did she look like?" Cordelia's eyes narrowed, just slightly. Common, poor, a blue dress that looked homemade. Why does it matter what she looked like? Julian did not answer right away. He was thinking of a night he had spent most of 10 years trying not to think about. The year his father had sent him to inspect the tenant villages along the eastern border. The night a fire had torn through a row of cottages in Millbrook, while he happened to be passing through with his escort. He remembered the heat of it, the screaming, the way half the village had frozen in place, while the other half fought a losing battle with buckets of well water. He remembered running into a burning cottage after hearing a child's voice, and pulling a small girl out through a window before the roof gave way behind them. He remembered, too, that in the chaos of getting her clear, in the terror of watching a building collapse seconds after he'd carried a 10-year-old girl out of it, he had knelt in front of her, checked that she was breathing, and said something he had not thought about in years, something about finding him again if she ever needed help. He had been 17, and frightened, and desperate to say something that would make a traumatized child feel less alone in the world. He had not expected her to remember it. He certainly had not expected her to hold him to it a decade later. "Her family," he said slowly. "Did she say what happened to her family?" Cordelia's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask. Julian, you cannot possibly be entertaining this. She's a stranger with a story. People invent connections to men like you constantly. It's how they survive." "Get her back," Julian said. "Excuse me?" "The girl. Find her and bring her back. Now, before she's gone too far down the road." Cordelia stood so fast, her chair scraped against the floor. "You want to invite a beggar into this house, days before our engagement is formally announced." "I want to know if she's telling the truth," Julian said, and something in his voice, quiet and certain, made Cordelia stop arguing, though the fury in her eyes did not fade. "If she is who I think she is, then I made her a promise, and I intend to keep it. Bring her back, Cordelia, or I will go find her myself." Cordelia left the study without another word, her silk skirts snapping around the corner of the door. Julian turned back to the window, though the drive outside was empty now, the girl in blue long since out of sight. He thought of the small hand that had gripped his sleeve as the cottage burned behind them, the way she had not cried, not once, even as everything she owned turned to ash. He remembered thinking, even then, that there was something in her he had never seen in anyone else, a refusal to break. He sat down heavily in the chair behind his desk and let himself remember the whole of that night properly, for the first time in years. He had been 17, sent by his father to inspect the eastern tenant villages, a duty meant to teach him the weight of the title he would one day carry. He had been riding back toward the manor with his small escort when the sky over Millbrook turned orange and he had ordered his men toward the fire before any of them could argue that it was not his place to risk himself for tenant cottages. He remembered the heat of it against his face from 30 yards away, remembered villagers running in every direction with buckets that could never keep pace with flames, already climbing 3 cottages at once. He remembered hearing, beneath the roar of it, a child's voice, thin and terrified, calling for a mother who was not answering. He had gone in without thinking, the way 17-year-olds sometimes do when their bodies decide faster than their minds can catch up. The smoke had been thick enough to blind him within seconds, and he had found her by sound alone, curled beneath a window in the back room, coughing, too frightened to move. He remembered how light she had felt in his arms, how her small hands had gripped the front of his coat with a strength that did not match her size, and he remembered the roof groaning above them as he half carried, half dragged her back through the door he had come in by. Seconds, only seconds, before the whole structure had given way behind them. He had knelt in the dirt outside, checking that she could breathe, that her eyes could focus on his face, and something about the sight of her, soot-streaked and shaking but utterly silent, had undone something in him he had not expected. He remembered thinking that a child who had just lost everything should have been screaming, should have been sobbing into the nearest adult's shoulder, and instead, she had simply looked at him with wide, steady eyes, as though she were the one deciding whether he could be trusted. He had not planned the words that came out of him next. He had simply wanted her to have something to hold on to besides the memory of fire. His father's man had pulled him away moments later, back toward the waiting carriage, back toward duties that could not wait, even for a burning village, and Julian had spent the ride home in silence, unable to shake the image of the girl standing alone in the ash, watching him go. He had asked, in the weeks after, what became of the survivors. He had been told, briskly, by his father's steward, that arrangements had been made, that the orphaned children had been placed appropriately, that he needn't concern himself further with matters already handled. He had been 17, and he had believed his father's steward, because that was easier than imagining a 10-year-old girl disappearing into a workhouse system that cared nothing for the promises made to her by the Duke's sons. He rose from his desk now and crossed to the window once more, though there was nothing left to see. 10 years. 10 years, he had told himself. The promise was the kind thing you say to comfort a frightened child, not a debt anyone truly expected to collect. 10 years he had let himself believe that was the end of the story. He had been wrong about that too, and something in him, watching the empty drive, felt something close to relief at being proven so. He had spent 10 years believing he would never see her again. He had been wrong. Wren had made it nearly a mile down the road when she heard hooves behind her, moving fast. She turned, half expecting the guards sent to make certain she truly left. Instead, it was the scarred-jaw guard from the gatehouse, out of breath, his horse blowing hard. "The Duke wants you brought back," he said. "Says it's urgent." Wren's heart moved strangely in her chest, a mix of relief and disbelief, so sudden it nearly buckled her knees. She had walked 3 days for this. She had stood at that gate and told herself she would not cry, no matter what happened. Now, faced with the possibility that it had actually worked, she found herself blinking back tears anyway. "Does he remember me?" she asked. The guard's expression softened slightly. He asked about a fire in Millbrook. "I'd say that answers your question, miss." The ride back to the manor felt shorter than the walk away from it, though Wren's hands did not stop trembling the entire way. When the gates opened this time, no one stopped her. She was led through a courtyard she had only glimpsed from the road, past fountains and hedges cut into careful shapes, toward the wide front doors of the manor itself. Julian was waiting in the entrance hall. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Wren studied the man standing before her, trying to find the boy who had carried her out of the fire inside this stern, composed stranger. He was taller than she remembered, broader, his face carrying the weight of responsibilities a 17-year-old could not have imagined. But his eyes, when they finally settled on her, held the same intensity she remembered from that night. The look of someone who did not do anything by half measures. "It's you," Julian said quietly. "You're the girl from the cottage." "Wren," she said. "Wren Ashdown." He crossed the hall until he stood only a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the exact moment recognition fully settled into his features. "You kept the ring," he said, his gaze dropping to the pendant at her throat. Wren's hand rose instinctively to touch it. "You said to find you if I ever needed help again." "I remember." "I need help, Your Grace." Something in the formal title made his jaw tighten, as though it sat wrong on him coming from her. "Tell me what happened to you. All of it. And tell me why it took 10 years. Wren drew a slow breath, steadying herself. She had not planned to tell her whole story, standing in a marble entrance hall with servants pretending not to listen from the edges of the room. But she had come too far to hold anything back now. "My family didn't survive the fire," she said. "My mother and my younger brother were still inside when the roof came down. I was sent to a workhouse because there was no one left to claim me. I spent 4 years there, before a woman named Mrs. Pell took me on as an apprentice seamstress. I've spent the years since learning a trade, saving what I could, and trying to become someone who wouldn't need to beg at anyone's gate." She lifted her chin. "I'm not here for charity, Your Grace. I don't want your money. I came because you told me to find you, and because I've had nowhere else to turn since the man who owns the sewing house where I worked decided I owed him more than my labor could repay." Julian's expression darkened. "Explain." "He's been telling creditors I owe a debt my late employer never actually owed him. He's threatened to have me arrested for it, unless I agree to marry his son. I ran before he could make good on either threat." Wren's voice did not shake, though the memory of it clearly cost her something. "I know it's a great deal to ask for a stranger's promise, but you're the only stranger who ever kept one for me." For a long moment, Julian said nothing. Then he turned to the nearest servant. "Prepare a room in the east wing," he said. "Miss Ashdown will be staying here as a guest of this house, under my protection, for as long as she needs." A murmur rippled through the hall, servants exchanging glances, and Wren caught sight of Cordelia, standing at the top of the staircase, her face carved from stone, watching the scene below with eyes that promised this was very far from over. "Julian," Cordelia called down, her voice sweet and sharp all at once. "A word, if you please." Julian did not look away from Wren. "In a moment." "Now," Cordelia said, and though her tone stayed pleasant, there was no mistaking the command underneath it. Wren watched him go, watched the way his shoulders squared as he climbed the stairs to meet his intended bride, and understood, with a clarity that settled cold in her stomach, that being let through the gate was only the first battle of a war she had not fully understood she was walking into. A young maid appeared at her elbow, dropping into a small, uncertain curtsy. "If you'll follow me, miss, I'll show you to your room." The girl introduced herself as Effie, as they climbed the grand staircase, her voice pitched low, glancing over her shoulder more than once, as though checking they were not overheard. She was perhaps 16, with quick eyes and a nervous habit of twisting her apron between her fingers. "You mustn't mind, Lady Cordelia," Effie whispered once they had turned down a quiet corridor. "She's like that with everyone who isn't useful to her. Cook says she once had a footman dismissed for looking at her the wrong way during breakfast." "I'll keep that in mind," Wren said, grateful for the small kindness of a friendly voice after the coldness of the hall below. "Most of us below stairs are glad someone's finally standing up to her. If I'm honest, miss," Effie added, quieter still. "Begging your pardon for saying so." They reached a room in the east wing, larger and finer than anything Wren had slept in since before the fire, with a wide bed, dressed in pale linen, and a window overlooking gardens cut into careful, geometric shapes. Effie busied herself lighting a fire in the small hearth, while Wren stood in the doorway, momentarily overwhelmed by the size of a room meant only for her. "Will there be anything else, miss?" "No," Wren said. "Thank you, Effie, truly." The girl gave a small, genuine smile before slipping out and closing the door softly behind her. and Wren was left alone, with the enormity of everything that had happened since she had woken that morning, in a tavern room, above a village she barely remembered, uncertain whether the day would end in a closed gate or an open one. She had not expected, whatever the outcome, to end it standing inside Thornbridge Manor as an invited guest, with a duke who remembered her name and a house full of strangers already deciding whether she belonged there. She sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, finally, a single unsteady breath that was not quite a sob and not quite relief, but something tangled between the two. The east wing room Wren was given was larger than the entire cottage she had grown up in. She stood at its window for a long time that first evening, looking out over gardens lit gold by the setting sun, and felt the strange, dizzying gap between the life she had lived and the one she had just stepped into. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. It was not a servant, but Julian himself, still in his formal coat, though he had removed his cravat, leaving his collar open in a way that made him look, for the first time since she had arrived, less like a duke and more like the boy who had run into a burning building without stopping to think. "May I come in?" he asked. "It's your house," Wren said, though she stepped aside to let him through. He did not sit. He stood near the window, looking out at the same gardens she had been watching, and for a while neither of them spoke. "I thought about you," he said finally, "more than I ever admitted to anyone. I used to wonder if you survived, if the workhouse was kind to you, if you ever thought of that night at all, or if you were too young to remember it clearly." He turned to face her. "I never imagined you'd come find me. I assumed, if you remembered anything, it would be the fire itself, not a promise made by a frightened boy trying to say something comforting." "It was the only kind thing anyone said to me that whole year," Wren said quietly. "You didn't know me. You had no reason to run into that cottage. But you did, and then you knelt down and made me a promise, like I mattered enough, to be worth keeping one to." She wrapped her arms around herself, though the room was not cold. "I held on to that more than I probably should have. It got me through years I don't like to think about." Julian's expression was unreadable for a moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. "I'm sorry it took me this long to be found. You didn't know where to look." "I could have looked harder." He crossed the room until he stood only a short distance from her. "I want you to understand something, Wren. This house is not going to be an easy place for you to stay. Cordelia's family and mine have old ties, financial ones that matter to my mother more than I wish they did. There will be people here who resent you simply for existing in a room they think should belong to someone born to it. I need you to know that before you decide whether to stay. I've survived worse than resentment," Wren said. "I believe you." His voice had gone lower, quieter. "But I'd rather you not have to survive it alone this time." The words sat between them, warmer than either of them seemed prepared for. Wren felt her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and from the way Julian's jaw tightened, she suspected he felt something similar and was fighting the urge to acknowledge it. "Your Grace, Julian," he corrected softly. "You knew me before I had a title. I'd like it if you kept knowing me that way, at least when we're alone." "Julian," Wren said, testing the name, and something in his expression eased at the sound of it. "Thank you. For today. For remembering." "I don't think I ever really forgot," he said. "I think I just told myself I had to, because a duke isn't supposed to spend 10 years wondering about a girl he met for 20 minutes during the worst night of her life." He left not long after, and Wren sat by the window until the gardens went dark, her heart doing something unfamiliar and unsteady in her chest, torn between the comfort of being remembered and the certainty that comfort, in a house like this one, rarely arrived without a price attached. She thought, as she finally lay down to sleep, of the years between the fire and this house, years she had spent so carefully guarding herself against exactly this kind of hope. Mrs. Pell had warned her once, not unkindly, that hope was a luxury poor girls paid for twice, once in the wanting and once in the losing. Wren had believed her for a long time. She was no longer certain she still did, and the uncertainty itself felt like the beginning of something she had not let herself want in years. The following morning, Julian insisted on showing her the estate himself, over the visible disapproval of nearly everyone in the household except Effie, who trailed a respectful distance behind them, carrying a basket, meant to look like an excuse for their walk. They passed through the orchards first, rows of apple trees just beginning to bud, and Julian spoke of the estate the way a man speaks of something he loves and resents in equal measure. The endless accounts, the tenant disputes, the constant balancing of duty against everything he might have chosen for himself, had he been born a second son instead of the heir. "Did you ever want something different?" Wren asked, "before all this became yours to carry?" Julian considered the question longer than she expected. "I wanted to travel. Once. Foolish thoughts a boy has before he understands what's expected of him. I used to imagine sailing somewhere no one had heard the name Ashford, where nobody would care whether I stood or sat, or spoke a certain way at dinner." He gave a small, rueful smile. "I gave that up quietly, the way most of us give up the things we want, in favor of the things we're told we must want instead." "That sounds lonely," Wren said. It was. Some days. He glanced at her sideways. Less so, lately. They walked in comfortable quiet for a while after that, past the old stone chapel at the edge of the grounds, its windows dark with age, and Julian told her, almost shyly, that his father was buried there, and that he still visited some mornings when the weight of the title grew too heavy to carry alone. Wren found herself listening, not as a guest, being given a tour, but as someone being slowly, carefully, let into a life few people were ever shown the private corners of. "You've changed," Julian said eventually, studying her with an openness that made her want to look away and lean closer all at once. "Not just older, steadier. The girl I pulled out of that cottage was brave, in the way frightened children sometimes are. All instinct and no choice in the matter. You're brave on purpose now. I noticed it the moment you refused to leave that gate." "I had to become someone who didn't leave gates easily," Wren said quietly. "The alternative was disappearing entirely, and I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to let that happen, even when it would have been easier." Julian did not answer with words. He simply looked at her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded moving across his face, before Effie cleared her throat pointedly from a respectful distance and reminded them both, gently, that the household would soon be wondering where its duke had disappeared to. The Dowager Duchess, Julian's mother, summoned Wren to her private sitting room the following morning, and the moment Wren stepped through the door, she understood that this conversation would carry none of the warmth of the one she'd had with Julian the night before. The Duchess was a small woman with sharp, assessing eyes, seated in a high-backed chair, as though it were a throne. She did not invite Wren to sit. "You've caused quite a disturbance in my household, Miss Ashdown," she said, without preamble. "My son has taken leave of his good sense, offering shelter to a girl he met once, a decade ago, during a fire he should never have run into in the first place." "I didn't ask him to run into it, Your Grace," Wren said carefully. "I was 10 years old and trapped. He made a choice that saved my life. And now you've arrived to make him pay for that choice for the rest of it." The Duchess rose, moving to a small writing desk near the window. "I will be plain with you, because I don't believe you're a stupid girl, whatever else you are. This family's finances have been unsteady for years. My son's marriage to Lady Cordelia is not romance, it is survival. Her family's fortune keeps this estate running, keeps the tenant villages fed through hard winters, keeps 400 people employed who would otherwise starve. If that engagement collapses because my son has developed a sentimental attachment to a seamstress, the consequences will fall on people who have nothing to do with any promise made during a fire." Wren felt the weight of that settle over her, heavier than any insult Cordelia had thrown at the gate. "I never asked him to break an engagement, Your Grace. I only asked for help finding safety. Then let me offer you a different kind of help." The Duchess opened a drawer and withdrew a small pouch, setting it on the desk with a soft, weighted sound. "There is enough here to settle whatever debt is chasing you, and enough left over to start a new life somewhere far from this county. All I ask in exchange is that you leave quietly, tonight, and never speak of my son's promise again." Wren stared at the pouch for a long moment. It would have solved everything. The debt collector who had chased her out of the sewing house, the fear of arrest, the exhausting uncertainty of not knowing where she would sleep next month. Every practical part of her mind told her to take it, but she thought of Julian's face the night before, the way he had said he never really forgot her, and something in her refused to let that be the last thing between them, a bribe accepted and a door closed. "I'm grateful for your generosity, Your Grace," Wren said quietly, "but I didn't come here for money. I came because your son told me to find him, and I intend to let him decide for himself what that promise is worth to him, not have that decision made for him by a payment I accept in secret." The Duchess's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "You misunderstand me, girl. This was not a request. With respect, Your Grace, it wasn't yours to make. I'll speak with Julian myself, about whatever he wants to do." "You will regret refusing me," the Duchess said, her voice gone cold and quiet, in a way that felt far more dangerous than shouting would have. Lady Cordelia's family did not build their fortune by losing gracefully, and neither did mine. I have tried to be reasonable with you. I will not try again." Wren left the sitting room with her hands trembling, though she kept her spine straight until the door closed behind her. She had turned down more money than she had ever seen in her life, in principle, in a house full of people who had already decided she did not belong. She told herself it was the right choice. She was not entirely certain she believed it. She found her way to the gardens, rather than her room, needing air, needing space, away from walls that seemed to press closer, with every conversation she had inside them. She sat on a stone bench beneath an old willow and let herself cry, quietly, for the first time since arriving at Thornbridge, not from weakness, but from the sheer exhaustion of holding herself together through gate after gate, threat after threat, since the moment she had first knocked on this family's door. She did not hear Julian approach until his shadow fell across the gravel path. "My mother spoke to you," he said. It was not a question. Wren wiped her face quickly, embarrassed to be found like this. "She offered me money to leave. I refused it." Something dark passed over Julian's expression. "I'll speak with her." "Don't," Wren said, surprising herself with the firmness of it. "She isn't wrong to be afraid, Julian. Your family's finances rest on this engagement. I understand what I'm asking you to risk, by even letting me stay here." "You're not asking me to risk anything," Julian said, sitting beside her on the bench, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers. "I'm choosing to. There's a difference, and I need you to understand it, because I think you've spent so many years being told your presence is a burden that you've started believing it by default." He turned to face her fully. "You are not a burden, Wren. You are the first honest thing that has happened in this house, in longer than I can remember. Your mother thinks I'll destroy everything your family has built. My mother has spent 30 years believing duty and survival matter more than anything else. I understand why. I've watched what worry over money did to my father, the years it aged off before his heart finally gave out under the weight of it. But I am not going to marry a woman I feel nothing for, simply to keep ledgers balanced, not when there's another option sitting right beside me who makes me feel more like myself than I have in years." Wren's breath caught, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The garden quiet, except for the soft rustle of willow leaves overhead. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight," Julian said finally, gently. "I only need you to know that whatever my mother offered you, whatever Cordelia threatens you with, it doesn't change what I've already decided about you. You don't have to earn a place here, Wren. You already have one." He left her there a short while later, and Wren sat beneath the willow until the last of the daylight faded, turning his words over in her mind like a stone worn smooth from handling, unsure whether to trust them fully, but unwilling, for the first time in years, to brace herself against the possibility that they might be true. Over the following days, Wren found a strange, uneasy rhythm inside Thornbridge Manor. Cordelia's contempt sharpened into something colder and more calculated, though she was careful never to show it in front of Julian. The Duchess kept her distance, her earlier warning hanging unspoken over every polite exchange. Only Julian seemed unchanged, seeking Wren out each evening under the excuse of showing her the estate, though both of them understood by the third evening that the excuse had worn thin. It was during one of these evenings, walking through the Manor's East Library, that Wren first noticed the ledgers. They were stacked on a side table near Julian's usual reading chair, thick leather volumes filled with the estate's accounts. Julian had stepped away to answer a servant's question, and Wren, out of habit built from years of managing Mrs. Pell's own modest books, found herself glancing over the open page without quite meaning to pry. Something in the numbers caught her attention immediately. There was a payment recorded 11 years ago, a substantial sum, listed only as Millbrook Resettlement, per agreement. Beneath it, a second entry from the same period noted a transfer of land deeds, the very village where Wren had grown up, from the Ashford estate to a name she did not recognize at first. She read it twice before the name settled into something familiar, Vane. Wren's pulse quickened. She turned the page, searching for more, and found a third entry, this one more troubling than the last. A payment made to a man identified only by initials, dated the same week as the fire that had killed her family, labeled simply clearance costs, per Lord Vane's instruction. Clearance costs, for a village that had burned down 2 days later. Wren, she startled, closing the ledger quickly as Julian returned, though not quickly enough to hide the paleness that had come over her face. "What is it?" he asked, crossing the room with quick, concerned strides. "These ledgers," Wren said slowly. "There's an entry from 11 years ago, land deeds for Millbrook, transferred to a Lord Vane, and a payment for something called clearance costs, dated days before the fire." Julian's face changed as he took the ledger from her hands, scanning the entries she pointed out. His jaw tightened as understanding settled over him, and Wren watched something like horror move behind his eyes. "Millbrook sat on land my father was pressured to sell," he said quietly. "I remember arguments about it, though I was young and paid little attention at the time. I always believed the sale fell through." He looked up at her, his expression grim. If Lord Vane purchased that land before the fire, and paid for something called clearance costs immediately after, that would mean that the fire wasn't an accident, Wren finished. That it was set to clear tenants who wouldn't leave willingly, so the new owner could do whatever he wanted with land that already belonged to him on paper. The room went very quiet. "Cordelia's father," Julian said, his voice flat with the effort of controlling it. "Lord Vane is her father." Wren's stomach turned cold. Her mother and brother had died in a fire that may have been set deliberately by the family her rescuer was now being pressured to marry into, for money that likely came, at least in part, from the very land taken from the ashes of her old home. "I need proof," Julian said. "Not a ledger entry that could be explained a dozen innocent ways by a clever lawyer. I need something undeniable, before I accuse the family my mother has staked this estate's survival on." "Then we find it," Wren said, steadier than she felt. "Together." Julian studied her for a long moment, something fierce and grateful moving across his face. "You came here for a promise I made you as a boy. I never expected you'd end up helping me uncover something this house has been hiding for a decade." "Maybe that's what the promise was always for," Wren said quietly. "Not just to save me once, but to make sure nobody else in Millbrook is forgotten either." They spent the rest of that night going through every ledger in the library, careful to return each volume to its exact place before dawn, so no one would notice they had been disturbed. What they found only deepened the unease settling over both of them. There were 3 more payments over the years that followed the fire, each labeled with vague, bureaucratic language, administrative fees, boundary adjustments, settlement of prior claims, each one paid from the Vane estate into accounts connected however loosely, to the Ashford family's own holdings. "It reads like a pattern," Wren said, rubbing tired eyes as the candle between them burned low. "Not a single crime. An arrangement. Something ongoing. My father accepted money from a man who may have burned a village to clear land he wanted," Julian said, his voice hollow with the effort of saying it aloud. I don't know if he understood what he was accepting payment for, or if he simply chose not to ask questions that were inconvenient to answer. Either way, this family benefited from what happened to yours, and I never knew, because no one ever thought a duke's son needed to understand where money came from, only that it kept arriving. Wren reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, an instinct rather than a decision. "You didn't do this, Julian. You were younger than I was when the fire happened. You can't carry guilt for choices made before you had any power to stop them." "No," he agreed, "but I can carry responsibility for what I do about it, now that I know." He turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together in a gesture that felt entirely natural despite how new it was. "Whatever this costs my family, financially, socially, I intend to see it made right. Not because it earns me anything, because it's the only decision I could live with, once I understood what I was looking at." They sat like that for a long moment, hands joined over old ledgers filled with the quiet arithmetic of a decade-old crime. And Wren felt, for the first time since walking through the manor gates, that she had not simply found shelter inside Thornbridge. She had found someone willing to stand beside her in whatever came next, regardless of what it cost him. Wren left the library near dawn, exhausted but too unsettled to sleep, and nearly collided with Cordelia in the darkened hallway outside her room. Cordelia's eyes moved immediately to the ledger Wren still carried under one arm, and something guarded flickered across her face. "Working late, are we?" Cordelia asked, her voice carrying none of its usual polish this early in the morning, stripped down to something closer to genuine suspicion. "Estate business," Wren said carefully. "Julian's, not mine to discuss." "How convenient that you've become so essential to my fiancé's business in the space of a week." Cordelia stepped closer, and for a moment, the mask of composure slipped further, revealing something Wren almost mistook for fear. "My father has built everything my family has on careful arrangements, Miss Ashdown. Arrangements that have kept this county running smoothly for a decade. I would think very carefully before disturbing things you don't fully understand." "Is that a threat?" Wren asked evenly. "It's advice," Cordelia said, though her tone made clear it was both. "Not everyone who digs into old accounts likes what they find underneath them. Sometimes it's better for everyone if certain stones stay unturned." She swept past before Wren could answer, and Wren stood alone in the hallway for a long moment afterward, certain now, in a way she had not quite let herself be before, that Cordelia knew more about her father's business than she had ever openly admitted, and that the coming days would test exactly how far the Vane family was willing to go to keep their stones from being turned. Wren should have known better than to think the ledger could stay a secret. 2 nights later, a young maid named Effie slipped a note under Wren's door after the household had gone quiet. Wren recognized her as one of the few servants who had shown her genuine kindness, rather than the wary distance most of the staff maintained, unsure how to treat a guest who was neither noble nor servant. The note was short and hastily written. "Be careful. I heard Lady Cordelia speaking with her father's man tonight. They know you've been asking about old accounts. They mean to discredit you before you can go further. Some plan to make you look like a thief, or worse at the coming ball. Trust no one but the Duke, E." Wren read it twice, her hands cold despite the warmth of her room. She had known, in the abstract, that digging into the Vane family's past would carry risk. Seeing it written plainly, a threat aimed directly at her, made the danger feel suddenly, uncomfortably real. She found Julian in his study late that night, still awake over correspondence, and showed him the note without a word. His expression darkened as he read it. "They'll try to discredit you publicly," he said. "At the ball my mother's already announced. the one meant to formalize the engagement. He set the note down, his jaw tight. If they succeed, it won't just be your reputation at risk. It will bury any credibility our accusations might have, before we've even made them. Then we need proof before the ball, Wren said. Something they can't twist into a story about a scheming stranger. The original land transfer documents would be filed with the county registrar, Julian said, thinking aloud. If Lord Vane paid someone to set that fire, there may be a record beyond the ledger, a receipt, a letter, something with his signature that can't be explained away as an innocent land purchase. Then let me go, Wren said. I know Millbrook. I know people who might remember more than official records ever wrote down. Survivors who never spoke up, because nobody with power ever asked them to. Julian hesitated. It's dangerous. If Cordelia's family suspects what you're looking for, they won't hesitate to make sure you never make it back to give evidence of anything. I've already survived one fire meant to erase people like me, Wren said, steady despite the fear sitting cold in her chest. I won't let them win by keeping quiet a second time. Julian studied her for a long moment, and something passed between them that went beyond gratitude, something closer to the fierce, unspoken understanding of two people who had both decided, independently, that this fight mattered more than their own comfort. I'll send Marcus with you, he said finally, naming the scarred-jaw guard who had first shown Wren kindness at the gate. He's loyal to me, not my mother, and not the Vanes. You leave before dawn, quietly. No one in this house can know where you've gone until you're back with what we need. And if I don't find anything, then we face the ball with what we already have, and hope it's enough. Julian's hand found hers across the desk, warm and steady. Whatever happens, Wren, I am not marrying Cordelia Vane, not after what her family may have done to your village. Not after everything I've remembered about what your promise was actually worth to me. That decision was made the moment I read that ledger entry, proof or no proof. Wren held onto his hand a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and neither of them pulled away first. Later that night, alone in her room, Wren found she could not sleep. She sat at the window, with Effie's warning folded in her lap, rereading it by candlelight, until the words had nearly worn themselves smooth from her attention. She thought of Cordelia's face at the gate on her first day, the cold certainty of a woman who believed nothing could touch the life she had already decided to claim. She thought of the Duchess's sitting room, the pouch of coins, the quiet threat beneath a voice that never once raised itself. These were not people who lost gracefully, and Wren understood, turning Julian's words over in her mind, that whatever she rode toward in Millbrook the next morning, she was doing so as a target now, not merely a guest. A soft knock came at her door near midnight. It was Effie, slipping inside with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. I couldn't sleep either, miss, not after what I overheard, the girl admitted. I brought you bread and a bit of cheese for the road tomorrow, and this. She produced a small folding knife, worn but well kept. It was my brother's, before he went as a soldier. I'd feel better, knowing you had something besides good intentions, if trouble finds you out there. Wren accepted both, touched by a kindness she had not expected from a girl who owed her nothing. Thank you, Effie, for all of it. The note. This. The friendliness nobody else in this house has bothered to show me. You stood up to Lady Cordelia at the gate before you'd even been let inside, Effie said, a small, fierce pride in her voice. Half the staff here have wanted to do that for years and never dared. The least I can do is make certain you come back to finish the job. Wren did not sleep much that night, but she found, lying awake and listening to the manor settled around her, that fear had begun to sit differently in her chest than it once had. It no longer felt like the fear of a girl with nothing to lose and nowhere to turn. It felt like the fear of someone who finally had people worth fighting to return to, which was a heavier kind of fear, but a far less lonely one. Millbrook had changed in 10 years, though not in ways that comforted Wren. The cottages that had once stood along the eastern road were gone entirely. replaced by neat rows of storage warehouses bearing the Vane family crest above their doors. Wren stood at the edge of what had once been her childhood home and felt a grief she thought she had already finished grieving rise up fresh and raw in her chest. Marcus, riding beside her, said nothing, giving her the silence she needed before they continued into the small village that remained further down the road, the handful of families who had rebuilt after the fire and stayed, unable or unwilling to start over elsewhere. It was there that Wren found old Tam, a fisherman who had known her mother, now bent with age but sharp-eyed as ever. He recognized her almost immediately, and the warmth in his greeting nearly undid the composure Wren had been holding onto since the ledger. "Wren Ashdown," he said, taking both her hands in his weathered ones. "I thought you were gone from this world entirely, girl. Where have you been all these years?" "Surviving," Wren said. "I need your help, Tam. I need to know the truth about the night of the fire, not what everyone was told, what actually happened." Tam's expression grew guarded, old fear surfacing behind his eyes. "That's a dangerous question to ask around here." "I know. I'm asking anyway." Tam glanced at Marcus, sizing him up, then led them both into his small cottage and closed the door behind them before speaking again, his voice dropping low. "There were men here that week, before the fire. Strangers, working for a lord none of us had met. They came offering money for the land, more money than any of us had ever seen. But old Reeves and your father, God rest him, refused to sell. Said the land had been in Millbrook families for generations and wasn't for sale at any price." He paused, his jaw working. 2 nights later, the fire started in 4 places at once. 4. Wren, that's not an accident. That's a message. Did anyone see who set it? "I did," Tam said quietly. "I never told a soul, out of fear for my own family. But I saw 2 men slip away from the eastern row, just before the flames caught, riding horses with a crest I didn't recognize then, but have seen plenty of since, painted on every warehouse that went up on our old land within the year." He met Wren's eyes steadily. "The Vane crest, girl. I'd swear it before any magistrate, if it would do any good after all this time." Wren's hands were shaking, though her voice stayed steady. "It will do good, Tam. I promise you it will. Will you come with me? Will you tell this to the Duke himself?" Tam was quiet for a long moment, weighing fear against 10 years of silence he had clearly carried, like a stone in his chest. "Your mother," he said finally, "was the only person in this village who ever showed me real kindness when my own wife passed, and I had nothing left. I owe her memory more than my own comfort." He nodded slowly. "I'll come. It's past time someone paid for what happened here." Before they left Millbrook, Wren asked Tam to take her to the small hillside where the fire's dead had been buried, a modest plot behind the rebuilt chapel, marked with simple wooden crosses that had long since silvered with weather. She found her mother's grave near the edge, her brother's smaller marker beside it, and knelt in the grass for a long moment, saying nothing aloud, though her lips moved through words she had carried unspoken for 10 years. "I found him," she finally whispered. "The boy who tried to save us. I found him, and I'm not going to let what happened to you be buried the way this hillside almost was." Marcus kept a respectful distance, and Tam stood beside her in silence, his weathered hand resting briefly on her shoulder, in the same way she imagined he might once have offered comfort to her mother, in some ordinary, long-ago moment neither of them had known would matter enough to remember. "Your mother would be proud of the woman standing here," Tam said quietly, "not because of any duke or any grand house waiting for you, because you never let this place turn you bitter, even with every reason to." Wren rose, brushing grass from her knees, and looked out over the rebuilt village one last time, at the handful of cottages standing where dozens once had, at the warehouse roofs, visible in the distance bearing a crest that would not stand unchallenged much longer. She thought of Silas Grieve, still somewhere behind her, likely furious by now at her disappearance, and found, to her own surprise, that she barely thought of him at all these days. He had once felt like the largest danger in her life. He had shrunk, somehow, against everything she had learned to face since. "Let's go," she said to Marcus and Tam both. "There's still work to do before the ball." They rode back toward Thornbridge with Tam mounted uneasily behind Marcus, the sun setting low and gold over roads that had once been Wren's whole world, and were now only the beginning of the fight ahead of her. The ballroom at Thornbridge Manor had been transformed for the occasion, chandeliers blazing, silk banners in the Ashford colours draped along every wall, a small orchestra playing near the far end of the room where the Duchess and Lord Vane stood, receiving guests with practiced smiles. Cordelia moved through the crowd in emerald silk, radiant and confident, playing the role of future Duchess, as though she had already claimed the title outright. Wren arrived on Julian's arm, dressed in a deep blue gown that Effie had helped alter for the occasion, and felt every eye in the room turn toward her, some curious, some openly hostile. She did not have to wait long for Cordelia's plan to reveal itself. Partway through the evening, a commotion rose near the refreshment table, a servant crying out that a piece of the Duchess's jewelry, a valuable emerald brooch, had gone missing, and that it had last been seen near where the Duke's mysterious houseguest had been standing not 20 minutes prior. "Search her," Cordelia said loudly, her voice carrying across the sudden hush of the ballroom, pointing directly at Wren. "It seems awfully convenient that a penniless stranger arrives at this house, and valuable jewelry begins disappearing." Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Wren felt the weight of 100 judging eyes settle on her, the exact fate Effie's note had warned her about, and for one cold, disorienting moment, she understood how easily a life could be ruined by an accusation, true or not. "I have nothing of the sort," Wren said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear tightening her chest. "Then you won't mind proving it," Cordelia said sweetly, gesturing to a footman already moving toward Wren with an expression of grim duty. "That won't be necessary," Julian said, stepping forward before the footman could reach her, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of the man who owned every inch of the room. "Because I believe the brooch will be found exactly where Lady Cordelia placed it herself, in the drawer of the side table nearest the terrace doors, where she was seen slipping something only half an hour ago." Cordelia's composure cracked for just a fraction of a second, quickly masked, but not quickly enough. "That's absurd. I would never—" "Marcus," Julian said, and the scarred guard stepped forward from where he had been waiting near the terrace, producing the missing brooch from exactly the drawer Julian had named, holding it up for the entire room to see. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The Duchess's face had gone pale with a fury that seemed aimed at everyone and no one at once. "This is a setup," Cordelia said, her voice rising, though the confidence beneath it had begun to fracture. "Someone is trying to make me look guilty of something I never, the same way your father made an entire village look responsible for its own destruction." Julian's voice cut across hers, cold and precise, and the ballroom went utterly silent. He turned toward the small door near the musicians, where Tam had been waiting, out of sight, for exactly this moment. "Come forward, please." The old fisherman stepped into the light, visibly uncomfortable in the borrowed coat Julian had provided him, but his voice did not waver when he spoke. 11 years ago, men working for Lord Vane offered to buy land in Millbrook, Tam said, addressing the stunned crowd directly. When the villagers refused to sell, the fire that killed half that village started in 4 places at once, 2 nights later. I saw the men who set it, riding away under the Vane family crest. I've carried that silence for 10 years out of fear. I'll carry it no longer. Lord Vane's face had gone the color of old parchment. "This is a lie, an old man's fantasy, nothing more." "There are land deeds, Lord Vane," Julian said, "transferred to your name, mere days before that fire, and a ledger entry in my own family's accounts, recording a payment to you, labeled clearance costs, dated the same week. I have both documents, and copies filed with the county registrar as of this afternoon, in case anyone in this room was considering making either of them disappear before morning. The ballroom erupted into chaos, guests turning to one another in shocked whispers, the Duchess sinking into a nearby chair, with a hand pressed to her chest, Cordelia standing frozen in the center of it all, her carefully built future collapsing around her, in front of every important family in the county. Wren stood beside Julian, her heart pounding, and understood that whatever came next, the silence that had protected the Vane family for 10 years, had finally, irrevocably, broken. Cordelia crossed the ballroom floor toward Wren before anyone could stop her, her composure gone entirely now, replaced by something raw and furious. "Do you think this changes anything?" she hissed, low enough that only Wren could hear it over the noise of the shocked crowd. "You'll always be a village girl playing dress-up in someone else's house. Whatever happens to my father, I will still be the one born to this world, and you will still be the one who had to claw her way into it." "You're right that I clawed my way here," Wren said steadily, refusing to let the words land the way Cordelia intended them to. "I'm not ashamed of that, Cordelia. I'm prouder of it than anything a title could have handed me for free. The difference between us was never birth. It's that I would never have built a life on land taken from people who burned for refusing to give it up." Cordelia's face twisted, something between rage and the first flicker of real shame Wren had seen from her since arriving at the manor. And for a moment, Wren almost pitied her, a woman who had spent her whole life believing her family's wealth was simply the natural order of things, never once asking where it had truly come from. "I didn't know," Cordelia said, quieter now, some of the fight draining out of her voice. "About the fire, I swear to you, I didn't know." "Maybe not," Wren said, "but you knew enough to try to have me thrown out as a thief tonight, rather than risk anyone asking questions that might lead here. That's a choice too, Cordelia. Just like silence was a choice for everyone in this county who suspected something and said nothing for 10 years. Lord Vane was being escorted from the ballroom by 2 of Julian's men as guests parted around him in a wide, uneasy circle, his protests growing weaker with every step toward the door. The Duchess remained seated, staring at nothing, the architecture of 30 years of careful planning collapsing around her in the space of a single evening. Julian crossed to Wren's side and took her hand openly in front of every family of consequence in the county, a gesture that carried its own quiet announcement about where his choices, going forward, would truly lie. "It's over," he said softly, for her ears alone. "No," Wren said, watching the room settle into stunned, murmuring clusters around them. "I think it's only just beginning." The weeks that followed, the ball moved quickly, though to Wren, they felt strangely suspended, as if the world had finally exhaled after holding its breath for a decade. Lord Vane's crimes could not be undone by a single confession in a crowded ballroom, but the evidence Julian had gathered, combined with Tam's testimony and the testimony of other Millbrook survivors who came forward once the silence finally broke, was enough to bring formal charges before the county magistrate. The engagement between Julian and Cordelia was dissolved within days, and though Cordelia herself insisted she had known nothing of her father's actions, the Vane family's standing in society crumbled regardless, their fortunes seized to pay restitution to the village their wealth had been built upon destroying. The Duchess, for her part, was slower to soften. She summoned Wren once more to her sitting room, though this time there was no pouch of coins waiting on the desk. "I was wrong about you," the Duchess said, the words clearly costing her something to admit. "I believed you were a threat to this family's survival. I did not understand you were the reason this family's survival would no longer be built on something rotten." She studied Wren for a long time. "My son loves you. I imagine you already know that. I would ask that you be patient with an old woman who spent 30 years believing duty and love could never occupy the same choice." "They can, Your Grace," Wren said gently. "I think Julian's been proving that since the night he ran into a burning building for a girl he'd never met." In the months that followed, Wren threw herself into the slow, careful work of rebuilding Millbrook properly, this time with the full resources of the Ashford estate behind her, rather than a single small pouch of coins meant to buy her silence. She oversaw the construction of a proper schoolhouse where the warehouses had stood, insisted that survivors like Tam receive fair compensation rather than charity, and made certain that every family displaced by the fire, or by the years of quiet payments that followed it, was given the chance to rebuild on land that was, at last, unquestionably their own again. Effie was not the only servant to find her fortunes changed. Marcus was made steward of the Eastern Estates, a position of real trust that suited a man who had proven, again and again, where his loyalties truly stood. Even Cordelia, stripped of her family's fortune and the engagement that had once defined her entire future, found an unlikely second chance when Wren, against the advice of nearly everyone in the household, offered her a position helping to manage accounts for the Millbrook rebuilding effort, on the condition that every shilling be handled with the same transparency her fathers had so thoroughly lacked. "Why would you do this for me?" Cordelia had asked, stunned, when Wren made the offer. "Because I know what it feels like to have people decide, on your behalf, exactly who you're allowed to become," Wren said. "You're not your father, Cordelia, not unless you choose to be. I'd rather give you the chance to prove that than assume I already know the answer." It was not friendship, not at first, and perhaps never fully would be. But it was something neither woman had expected from the other on the night of that ballroom confrontation. And it was, in its own quiet way, a kind of justice too. It was on a warm evening in early autumn that Julian found Wren in the same library where they had first uncovered the ledger, and knelt before her with a small box in his hands, inside it a ring far grander than the simple silver one she had carried for 10 years, though she noticed, with a rush of feeling she could not quite name, that the old ring had been reset into the new one's design, a promise made once folded permanently into the promise being made now. "10 years ago, I told a frightened girl to find me if she ever needed help again," Julian said. "I never imagined that promise would lead here, to you, standing in front of me, not as someone who needed saving, but as someone who saved an entire village's chance at justice, and saved me from a marriage that would have made me complicit in the very crime that took your family from you." He looked up at her, his composed, bearing giving way entirely to something raw and hopeful. "Wren Ashdown, will you marry me? Not because of a promise made in fire 10 years ago, because of everything I've learned about who you are since you walked back through that gate." Wren knelt down in front of him instead of simply answering, until they were at eye level, the way he had once knelt in front of a frightened child, in the smoke and ruin of everything she had known. "Yes," she said. "Not because you owe me a promise, Julian, because I choose you. That's different, and I wanted you to hear the difference." Their wedding was held the following spring, not in the grand cathedral in the county seat that the Duchess had originally planned for Julian's engagement to Cordelia, but in Millbrook itself, in a modest chapel rebuilt with funds from the Vane family's seized fortune, surrounded by the survivors of a fire that had once tried to erase an entire village from memory. Old Tam walked Wren down the aisle, since she had no family left of her own to do it, and wept openly through the entire ceremony, unashamed. Effie, promoted to head housekeeper of the East Wing at Wren's insistence, stood near the front with tears of her own. And when Julian slipped the ring, silver and gold intertwined, onto Wren's finger, the whole village erupted into applause, loud enough to carry clear across the rebuilt rooftops of the town that had once burned to the ground. There is a lesson in Wren and Julian's story that reaches far beyond one duke and one village girl. Kindness offered without expectation of return has a way of finding its way back to us, sometimes 10 years later, sometimes in forms we never could have predicted. And silence, however comfortable it may feel in the moment, only ever protects the people who benefit from wrongdoing. It is the willingness to speak, even after years of fear, that finally sets things right. Wren Ashdown spent 10 years believing a single kindness from a stranger was the only thing standing between her and a world that wanted to forget she existed. She returned not to collect a debt, but to prove that some promises are worth keeping, and that the people who keep them are worth everything it costs to find them again. If this story moved you, subscribe so you never miss the next one, and leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I would truly love to say hello to you personally, just to know how far across the world this story has traveled, and how far we're going together from here.